Welcome to the 2015 Virtual Program Evaluation Summer School. We're so glad that you've joined us this morning. It's a great day here, and joining me from Iowa is Dr. Nancy Franz.
Good morning, folks, and welcome. Glad to see all the familiar attendees, and hello to those of you I haven't met yet.
The session title for today is The Art and Science of Environmental Scanning, Staying Real in Rapid Change. From your life experiences, your perspective, and we're going to be sharing this later on with our group. Why do you think, from your life experience, individuals and organizations resist change? And we're going to discuss this just a little later on, giving folks the time to go ahead and enter.
So as you're entering that, let's think about, you've mentioned in the Q&A why it is you think we resist change. Oftentimes organizations decline because they haven't done a good job of environmental scanning. They don't really see what's going on around them. And so there are a number of organizations that have declined over the years because they failed to do good environmental scanning and or act on that scanning. So here are some examples that I've seen over the years that I think are important to think about. So first of all, when we talk about organizational decline, it means sometimes organizations have failed to innovate. And in fact, Clayton Christensen with the Harvard Business School says that if we don't do disruptive innovation, we will decline. We will do the same old, same old. His definition of innovation is disruptive innovation. He said oftentimes it takes a variety of disruptive innovations for an organization to stay real and current. And his definition of disruptive innovation is a fundamentally different way of competing that leads to a new way of business. So we'll be using that as a framework today, a definition that a new way of doing business, looking at the world differently. So here are 4 different observations I've had of organizations that have declined, at least in the last decade, maybe more, because they have not done disruptive innovations to keep up with the environment. They didn't scan enough to make sure that they were relevant. So think about Kodak being an organization that has basically gone out of business because it didn't get into the digital revolution. Think about print newspapers, the number of newspapers that have been sold or folded or gone out of business because they've stayed mostly in the print venue. And we'll talk later about how our demographic has changed, what's really driven this. Organized religion, some in North America is doing very well, others are not, because the religion has not stayed up to date to meet people's needs where they're at. And civic organizations. You'll read, if you read Robert Putnam's book on social capital, his major thesis is that civic organizations and related social capital have declined in a lot of communities, and so we in Extension are working very hard to help organizations and communities regain that social capital so civic organizations can survive. Now, I don't know about you, but in some of the communities here in Iowa, we have people who are running as a write-in on the ballot for their city and town councils and getting elected with 35 votes. There's that amount of lack of civic engagement. So as we talk about environmental scanning, a major reason for scanning is to make sure our organization does not go into decline or those that we work with.
So now it's your turn to talk again. We want you to sound off. In your Q&A box, please list a few disruptive innovations for Nancy and I, or events that you've actually lived through that have changed business practices across the world. So in your lifespan, and there's people of all ages from all over the country participating today, what are the things that you've seen that you would call a disruptive innovation or event that totally changed the way business worked or impacted a business? And questions, comments, observations are coming in, and we're going to talk about those. Continue to enter those as we proceed through a little bit of the content. One of the things I want everyone to consider, again, about almost 40% of participants today have not really done an environmental scan. And this is not really about environmental scanning, but it's something that anyone doing environmental scanning or strategic planning needs to kind of just think about just a little bit, is that we're all vulnerable for this condition called groupthink. And this, to me, was a real pivotal thing in understanding why some organizations fail. Organizations that have been historically successful fail. And there are a couple of issues. One is that with groupthink, we have reasons to self-censor. And think about that. If you're in a group meeting, do people always say what they think? Do people always give that outlier, that perspective that doesn't go with the flow or causes the ruffles to be flustered a little bit or ruffled a little bit? Particularly in organizations where people really want to have a positive affiliation, or they value their affiliation with that organization. They like each other, just like Extension. Oftentimes you'll find that people don't want to make any waves. They don't want to ruffle the feathers. And so even though you may see things changing and you may see conditions that the organization needs to respond to, oftentimes nobody will say anything. There's a lot of examples of groupthink going very bad in our country. The Challenger accident was examined by organizational development specialists, and they found that groupthink was going on. It created this crisis because even though the engineers at a very high level met around the conference room table, there are recordings of this. No one person spoke up one time and was quickly censored. And so this group of scientists proceeded on with the launch of the Challenger, even though there were people that knew there were problems. Environmental scanning is basically the worldview. And Nancy's going to go into detail in each of these categories a little bit later and give contemporary examples. But for those of you who've never done it, I'm just going to look at the big picture. Environmental scanning is not what we think. It's a systematic method of looking at the big picture. It's not just, well, this is what I've seen or what I've seen. Oftentimes, if you do an environmental scanning, you will discover things that you never knew were going on because it's not within your sphere. It's not within your realm. So we'll walk through these real quickly. Social, what's going on socially? How are people communicating? How are people engaging? Is the coffee shop where the majority of your clientele meet and still discuss things? In some parts of the country, in some communities, that's probably true. In other communities, in other parts of the country, not at all or not so much. So if Extension and other organizations like Extension want to continue for the next 100 years, we've got to show up and we've got to know where people are showing up. Technologically, what's going on in this world? Not just what's happening now, but if you're doing environmental scanning, you're looking into the future. And so you're collecting data systematically in a way that you understand what the next big thing is so that you can adopt and adapt your organization to living in this world and being on cutting edge, not following behind. Economic. Do you think that the economic downturn can affect Extension? Well, it has in our 100 years. Do you think it might in the future? Now that we have a world market, it's a whole new ball game. Environmental, a lot of changes on this landscape for sure. The whole organic movement, the reuse, reduce, recycle, that's more than just a trend, that's a value system. And it's a very powerful value system in a growing, emerging population who really care about this. And by the way, can communicate very effectively. So what are we on the threshold? What do we need to respond to? And then last but not least, what's the political arena? Very, Nancy already referenced this, very interesting dynamics about engagement and choice and how that influences our organization. If we're not aware of those issues, then how can we respond and actually remain relevant? So that's the science, basically, and there's lots of methods to do that, to collect that information, organize that information from an evaluation, strategic planning standpoint. There's also a science to it and an art to it, like Nancy said. But the one point that we want to make through this presentation is if all that you do, which is not so long ago, all that most organizations did, is do environmental scanning every 5 years when you're working on your strategic plan, then you're going to miss the boat because on our landscape, in our landscape now, there are innovations and changes that are rapid and substantial and impactful for our clientele and certainly for us. So it's not good enough anymore to once every 5 years to do an environmental scan in a very formal way to look at that landscape and put it on the shelf. We really, if we're going to continue to be responsive and relevant, we have to be continually scanning in a very fluid manner to look at what's happening, how it impacts our clientele, and how it can impact us as an organization. Now, I've heard people say that, you know, we can't forget our traditional clientele. They're the bread and butter of our success. And I will say, we have done a great job of going to where our clientele are, serving the needs of our clientele, connecting research with early adopters in applying new technologies. But in order to do that, we're going to need more than a car this day and time. So Fortune 500 companies often within 5 years have gone bankrupt. It's something for us to remember. We've got a greater and better track record than that. But to go forward, we're going to have to do some things a little different. Nancy's been monitoring the feedback, the Q&A, and ideas that you've had, and so I'd like her to kind of comment on some of those things, and because we want to look at what you have to say as well today.
I found it really interesting to take a look at what people's responses were. The first question about why do people resist change? And you actually came down to the actual 3 responses that the research tells us. So I guess you're normal according to the research. The number 1 reason that you stated that people don't change, organizations resist, is fear. Whether it's fear for their own personal security, fear of the unknown, fear of what the future will bring, but that's the number 1. The second one is discomfort, is that change is going to make people uncomfortable. People don't want to get out of their comfort zone. And then the third is that it takes time and energy. And truthfully, I like putting my energy and my time into what I'm currently doing. So know that you're normal if you want to be, based on what the research says as the most common reasons we resist change and our organizations resist change. And I think we all know that the larger the organization is and the more bureaucratic, often the much harder it is for change to get hold. And we've probably all experienced that being part of higher education. The second question we asked you about some examples of disruptive innovation or innovations. By far, the top thing you responded was technology, whether it's the internet and social media, email, cell phones, all of those things that have come about in the last decade or so that have us changing the way we live and communicate and work in the world. One thing that I thought was interesting is there was also the innovation of what I would call the innovation of unrest. Someone mentioned protests, and I actually think I have not heard much about that, but I think we need to think seriously about over our history. Protests have been used as ways to change and shape what's going on in the world. And so that was one innovation that I think has some more possible discussion. Another innovation that was mentioned are selfie sticks, and we've heard a lot about that recently. I would call that a tool. Maybe social unrest is a tool as well. So we have technology and new tools that are changing the way that we look at the world. And then there were some things that you listed that weren't really innovations, but they're more factors of what's going on in the environment as you scan it or live it. One in particular that was articulated that I think we all feel is that we see a change in values around us based on maybe some people suggested administrators have different values and so their actions are different. I would suggest that maybe society's values have changed as well over time, and that's part of our environmental scanning. And that leads to things like budget changes that some of you mentioned you're feeling in your external environment. So Karen, those are some of the things that I saw summarized from the Q&A. I think people are right on top of it.
Thank you, Nancy, and thanks everyone. Get ready to continue to participate in the discussion because we've got some more questions coming up. We're going to now kind of shift and move from the theoretical to what's going on out there, some of our observations, and some of the things that cooperative extension, it's not necessarily the future, it's what we're dealing with now. And the stress and the pressures in this new landscape that we're having to respond to and address, or not so much, that impacts the way we work and certainly the way people perceive us as relevant or not.
I would suggest that the number one thing Extension needs to pay attention to, and is starting to, but of course not as quickly as we probably should if we'd like to prevent decline, is our demographics. We see huge changes going on in the demographics of our workforce, who is available to be Extension workers or in the workforce we're working with. And truthfully, we're seeing a huge increase in millennials just because of the number of millennials who are available and the number of baby boomers like me who are retiring. And so we, as Extension folks, have not reached out very well to millennials as the workforce. So for example, I spoke at it was NACDEP in Little Rock not too long ago, and of all the people attending the conference, only maybe 10 people or less in the room were millennials. And so we need to really think about how do we reach out to millennials, how do we engage with them, and instead of expecting them to just step right up and join us, how do we meet them where they're at? So a couple of things that I've noticed about working with millennials is they are very social and constantly engaged. They blur the boundaries between work and personal life so that it becomes an integrated work-personal balance rather than a work-life balance. It's all integrated. And so even though you won't see some millennials at the office from 8 to 5, you'll see them engaging in work at midnight and 2 in the morning and on the weekends through technology and other means. So we need to change some of the ways that we look at actually doing work to meet millennials where they're at. They also highly value diversity. They want to work in diverse communities, diverse workplaces. They want to engage with a wide variety of people. And they define diversity as really wide open. It's not just race, it's not just ethnicity, it's all kinds of differences. And they see that not as a mandate or a legal situation, they see that as a pleasant way to live. And another thing that I notice about millennials is that place is really important. And so they really enjoy living in a community that's vibrant. They don't want to live in a dying community. They want to live in a community where lots of things are happening. And they also really like engaging with local food systems. So we need to think about millennials. You'll also probably know, if you've done any environmental scanning, that we have a very swift aging of the population taking place all across the country. There are some hotspots like Florida and Iowa and Texas and California where the oldest of the old are residing and quickly becoming a large population. We need to think about the aging population not just as a group of people who are retiring and going off into the sunset, but a group of people who are a huge resource pool for us as volunteers, also users of services. And how do we help everybody, all communities, help folks access and engage with those services that are available. And baby boomers see themselves as lifelong learners. They tend to be less financially ready for retirement than previous generations. And they also have a high sense of adventure and want to relive parts of their past. So they're looking at a very active, older lifestyle compared to some previous generations. So I think those are a couple of things we need to keep in mind as we think about what innovations we need to take place. We also need to think about, as you mentioned earlier in your response to the question about change, is that there is this huge increased use of technology. Not just technology for using it, but having access to a wide variety of things. So most of us go to the Pew studies when we're looking for the latest statistics on what's going on with technology access and use. And here are kind of the 4 major things that the Pew study has shown us most recently. Everybody has easier access to more and more and more information. We see increased use of mobile devices. In fact, looking at the generations, we see baby boomers using handheld devices and not using laptops as often, and rarely, if ever, using a desktop, something that maybe was provided by an employer. We see the opposite of baby boomers. We tend to use desktops and laptops, and we're still getting used to how to integrate handheld devices into our lives. We see a lot of change globally around diversity. So, for example, I have a friend who teaches at the London Business School, and he said when they ask students their race or ethnicity or local origin, they answer in about 12 different responses. He said they don't say, I'm white Caucasian or I'm black. They say that they are a variety of backgrounds and places. So I think we need to realize that more and more all of those boundaries are blurring, and we are seeing ourselves as not any one thing. We are seeing ourselves as a conglomerate or an integration of many, many things. And so we need to get out of those single boxes that you check off and realize that humans are humans. We do have lots of individual ways of being. And how do we meet people as individuals rather than as just part of those boxes? The other thing that we need to keep in mind that Karen and I have been talking about is this rate of innovation is really moving very, very rapidly. We would see innovations happening here and there. In fact, I remember when I went up for associate professor, and I had to actually write up innovations as part of my dossier for tenure and promotion. And you'd write down some little innovation that you did. I was like, for example, the first 4-H agent that ever used a VHS video to teach music and games for camp. You know, that was the big thing. Now when you look at dossiers for tenure and promotion, you're seeing 5 to 10 innovations at least that people are putting in place. So you can see here that there are all kinds of trends we need to think about when we look at innovation and why it's moving so quickly. And so you can just take a look at that and know that this rate of innovation and these items of the trends are changing quickly. So U.S.-China's future is changing very quickly, you know, and next week that could be U.S.-Russia's future or U.S.-Iran's future. We're seeing tons of these things changing very quickly, and you could probably add other trends that you see about what's happening in our future.
Nancy?
Yeah.
One of the participants said, how often should environmental scanning be done if 5 years is too long? And before we get to that question, I just want to point out to participants that the answer probably is yes, it is too long. That's kind of the point of this presentation, and that it needs to be fluid. But also, if you'll look at all those resources that are cited on this slide, the good news is that there's lots of digital resources, online resources that are already doing this, that are already identifying the next big thing and doing outlooks. So it is a very easy thing now, or relatively easier thing, to actually do a rapid assessment of population, both regional, local, and also trending related to medicine, health, and the items that we have touched on are really just very few. There's all kinds of predictions and projections based on very systematic data collection. So the good news is that you can do environmental scanning fairly rapidly. You just got to focus what you want to look at. But all of these resources are very well respected and have been doing this for some time.
That's, you know, a great question. And I've been doing a lot of strategic planning with nonprofits, and they're wanting to do 5- and 10-year plans. And I say, no, I won't do it. I won't go any further out than 2 years because things are changing so quickly. And so my suggestion about when you ask how often should you do environmental scanning, the answer is always, always. I don't think there is any particular high moment for environmental scanning anymore. We used to do needs assessment or environmental scanning as part of our plan of work process every 4 to 5 years, dictated by the feds. Well, now that isn't dictated anymore. It's a rolling thing every year. And truthfully, any good business, any good organization is constantly doing environmental scanning. Any good extension educator or administrator is constantly doing environmental scanning on a daily basis. Now, there may be formalized structures that are put in place. So there may actually be a unit or individuals that are constantly looking out at the environment, sharing articles, sharing artifacts online for people to take a look at. There may be folks that have it more in their position to help keep the organization focus. Even when you bring environmental scanning down to your own personal place, where do you want to be in so many years? It's no longer the question, where do you want to be in 5 years? It's what would you like to see in place a year from now or 2 years from now? So I think our time horizon has really changed a lot. So with that said, oh, go ahead, Carolyn.
So how do we stay relevant?
Yeah. So with that said, how do we actually do this thinking on a daily basis? So here are a number of bullets that come from Clayton Christensen. He said, for disruptive innovations to happen, these are the things you have to attend to. You have to take a look at whatever it is you are putting forward. Is it affordable? And if what you are providing is more affordable than somebody else's, you're more apt to get the market share, the clients, the learners, etc. So Ben Silman, for example, put up a question about where does rapid e-learning come in within environmental scanning? Well, I think rapid e-learning is possibly for a lot of people affordability, and then that next piece, accessibility, is that people want something fast, they want it now, they want it easy, and they want to be able to do it whenever they want to do it, and they don't want to pay a whole lot for it. And so I think really rapid e-learning is a symptom of these two pieces of relevance. I also think that we need to look at capacity. Now, sometimes we see ourselves totally as helping people build their capacity to do something else. And so how are we helping them do that? Sometimes we can't be affordable, or our accessibility is reduced because we're working on specific kinds of capacity building. And I think specifically, you know, when you look at volunteer development and community development and youth development, that all comes under capacity. And so it may cost a young person or a family more to participate in a youth development experience, but it's building capacity more than some other programs might. Responsiveness, Clayton Christensen says if you can't be there yesterday for the client and anticipate their need, then you're already behind. And I think Apple is a great example of this. You know, they're already cooking up devices like the watch with, I don't really need, but they're going to convince me that I need it. So they're actually pre-responsive. They have not yet made the model that will fit my wrist, but, you know, it will come. Simplicity, and you could add elegance onto that. People want something that's easy to use, that's not complex. When I did strategic planning for a nonprofit here in town the other night, I got it down to 4 steps. They thought that was amazing. They got it done in 2.5 hours, and we're just thrilled that what used to take 2 weeks in strategic planning became much more simple. And part of that, I think we can be more simple because truthfully, our clientele are getting smarter and they better understand some of the steps. Customization is something else that Christensen says. If we can customize something directly for the person, the end user, the client, the learner, the extension clientele, they are more apt to adopt whatever it is we're putting out there. And then the last thing that I think is really important is a lot of what we do is we're looking at symptoms. We're not looking at the root causes. Why are young people at risk? Not because we need to deal with crime or we need to deal with depression and suicide. We need to know why they're at risk. Are there policy changes needed? Are there environmental changes needed? So I think those are really important things to keep in mind. If you want to read more about this, you can go to the Journal of Extension. Ron Cox and I have an article on disruptive innovation, and you can learn more about it, and all the references are in there. So with that in mind, with learning being the product that we sell, what are the disruptive innovations that we might find? Well, truthfully, many of you have already seen these 4 approaches to extension work through some of the things that I've published, and got that truthfully from my PhD advisor, Meryl Ewert at Cornell. Service was one of the reasons that we started as an extension system, and content transmission. Service, giving people what they needed, whether it was soil tests, pressure canner, cooker tests, whatever it might be. Content transmission was really our, as Karen said earlier, our bread and butter, whether it was face-to-face or it was newsletters or fact sheets or whatever. Content transmission is less our purview now and rarely leads to intentional learning. It leads to maybe just-in-time learning, but it has really been taken over by the internet and other sources. We are not the top valued source for content anymore. It's important that we have that content and we develop it. Facilitation has become more of our approach in the past 2 decades or so. sometimes seen as the purview of our community development folks, when in fact I believe it belongs to every extension worker to have the skills to facilitate group processes. That helps us be seen as educators, people who work well with groups of people, but doesn't necessarily get us into the innovator phase. Well, I suggest, my theory is that if we focus on transformative learning, that will be much more intentional learning, and that's where the disruptive innovations will come out of, and that's where change will actually come out of. And transformative learning being a very deep learning where people change their way of seeing the world and actually act differently. And that's the combination of having great content and having great people processes, teaching processes. So a number of you have heard me talk about this in the past, and I just encourage you to go back to other sources to learn more about that. But I think that as part of our environmental scanning, we've got to realize that our response to what we see in the environment, these are our 4 traditional responses. If we're really looking at innovation, transformative learning is probably where most of it takes place. So with that in mind, how do we move from incremental innovation, which is truthfully a lot of what we've seen in extension, and move to that disruptive innovation? Truthfully, disruptive innovation, here you see again, changes the way we improve things to really be better attractiveness to who's out there. And so, truthfully, what's moved us as the innovation has been budget reductions or funding changes. That's really been the only environmental piece that has forced us to change. Once in a while, we will see an innovation by an individual or a team or a group in education and reaching our clients. But truthfully, the major disruptions have come from budgetary changes. So things that I suggest that will help us do more in disruptive innovation is start with the early adopters. So who are the people who are creative, who really see a different world, and how do we support them instead of tamping them down into the traditional extension culture and sometimes, most likely, forcing them out. I have to say most of the creative and visionary people get forced out of extension by the culture that focuses on comfort and fear. I also think we need to resource skunkworks. That comes out of the IT area in Silicon Valley, where people actually experimented in their garages with things, and that was a skunkworks. When I was associate dean, I actually gave a group of people permission to go off and try some projects that I knew were controversial, and that I would protect them from the evil forces and give them some resources. And they came up with an interesting project that I'll tell you about later. We need to hire and support innovators. We tend to hire them, but then we don't support them. I think that's important. We need to watch other innovative organizations and be out on the fringes and seeing who's really getting the learning market share these days, who's really getting the funding that we'd like to get, and what is that about, and how do we be a part of that? And some of our extension systems are doing a good job of watching, and then the next step, of course, is to act on that. And then finally, how do we use scenario planning for the extremes? There is some scenario planning that goes on, usually around budgeting, but we don't have any scenario planning around program development. Why wouldn't we have people out there taking a look at what happens if all our clientele was over 65? How would that change who we are? What would happen if none of our clientele came to face-to-face meetings anymore? How would that change? What would happen if we no longer received any funding from federal government for education? What would that mean? And so we really need to do some scenario planning, because out of scenario planning often comes the innovations.
Nancy?
Yeah.
One of our participants, Jim, poses this question, which really fits this portion of the presentation. From a systems perspective, how does CES become a faster learning organization?
Oh, I think that's a great question. And that's a question that I've been actually working on my whole career. And I've decided that extension as a system can't move quickly because it's not a system. Very honestly, it's a gathering of units that come together every so often. We don't have a national emphasis of working together. We do a really good job of being great in our state. And so we don't see, like some other organizations across the country or businesses where they have a headquarters that leads, or we don't have that. We have partners. And so we try to work from collaboration rather than leadership. And what that means is that we can only move as fast as the people who want to move fast across the country. And so, you know, we have NIFA and we have ECOP, but those are partners. We have professional associations, those are partners, but there is no national agenda for extension to change. And so what we have to do instead is we have to work, as we always have, from local innovations. So what is it that we can do as individual educators or individual administrators or individual extension systems that we choose to do as innovations, and then how does that get disseminated across the country? And one example that I could use that I hear Mary Arnold talk about quite a bit is when the University of Wisconsin Extension decided it was going to be the innovator in program evaluation. And it hosted nationwide workshops, and it put out tons of resources on program evaluation and built Extension's evaluation capacity, and actually moved us about a decade ahead of where we were in about 5 to 10 years, really moved us further ahead in evaluation. We've not seen an extension system do much of that since. We still have some people doing it out there, but not in the name of the whole country. So if we could get individual extension systems to step forward and say, we're going to be the innovator in online technology, we're going to be the innovator in social media, and really have that happen. I know extension directors have talked to E-Extension about that recently, and E-Extension is going to take the lead for some things that may help that. But, you know, at this point in time, the way we're organized, we won't see national movement from a national level. We'll see national movement from local people and systems bringing extension forward. So the answer is, if we all could be innovative ourselves and bring our own systems along and work together with each other to do that, that's how we can speed up innovation in extension. Great question. So, what other kinds of questions have we had come up, Karen? Anything else we should address?
Lots of things. Jim said that large group processes is changing the way he looks at facilitation and in civic engagements. And he sent out kudos to the Purdue Center for Regional Development on their work in that. We're going to open this up for another question, and we'd like y'all to all contribute, because this is kind of a follow-up to what Nancy just discussed. What disruptive innovations or changes does Extension need to make as we consider going into the future? What is it that we should be doing within ourselves? What kind of innovations and changes should we be doing? So if you would, enter your ideas and your thoughts, maybe even some examples of things that you think is an example of this that may be possibly occurring in your state. So if you would, just take a minute to do that. And then Nancy's going to talk to us about some examples that she's observed.
Yeah, I'll give you one example that's an extension example, and one that's an educational example that is not formally branded extension, but is truthfully engagement at a university. So the first one is the Skunkworks group that I mentioned, the EcoFamily program. If you want to learn more about this, you can go, again, read a Journal of Extension article. The first author is Anthony Santiago. So if you put in EcoFamily in Santiago, it will come up. This was a group of people who wanted to do environmental education at the family unit level. What we discovered nationwide is that environmental education had been done at the organization level, the community level, and the individual level, but rarely at the family level. So it was a combination of combining family development theory and practice with environmental education. So that the innovation in the content was new and the approach. Well, they decided they were going to have kind of a family day at the research station at the experimental farm and get people to come, and they do environmental stations and all this stuff. Well, nobody registered, and they were just devastated. And that's when I challenged them to take a look at innovations. And so they developed a program totally online with a suite of a variety of ways to reach families. And they have families from all over the country that now engage in webinars and social media and a variety of other things. And so they're finding that as a very useful way to do this program to meet families where they're at. Now, it may not be an innovation in general. This kind of stuff has been going on for a while, but it was truthfully an innovation for this unit of extension. The other example is I just finished a class, a summer school class on Iowa Black history. And I decided to take it for a couple of reasons. One is I wanted to see what they were doing with the technology. One was I was interested in the content. Having only lived in Iowa for 5 years, I wanted to get a better sense of the history. And also, I wanted to support my coworkers in the School of Ed. I've been thrilled with what they put together. There are 130 people in the class, and I'm guessing maybe about 30 of them are taking it for credit, and the rest of us are citizens from all around the state who are just taking it as personal learning. This is probably the first time that the School of Education has done this kind of hybrid between people taking it for credit and those who aren't. And it's this combination of technology and face-to-face. So it's a hybrid. There were all these modules we would do, conversations, you know, the usual kind of online class stuff. But then there was also a day where there was a workshop for people to come and hear major speakers about education and Black history. And there was also a day, actually today, where 3 libraries across the state would open their archives on Black history for people to come and discuss them and take a look at them. So there were kind of these field trip kinds of things. There's now been a spin-off of a Facebook page to keep in touch and a number of other things. And at the same time, the professor, the assistant professor, is using this as her research agenda to determine how effective this form of learning is, and to actually see if those of us who took the class have changed our perspective, if we've had transformative learning around Black history and Black people in Iowa. So she really wanted us to learn about Iowa, but at the same time learn about ourselves. And she had this huge variety of learning objects, so a great diversity of learning objects, not just the same old kind of stuff. And so really, truthfully, it was transformative learning. I stopped and chatted with a Black coworker yesterday on campus and said, I had no idea that in 1990, the Ku Klux Klan was marching on Dubuque, Iowa. I never even thought the Ku Klux Klan was in Iowa as a northern state, let alone in 1990. And she said, well, why would you have needed to know that? It's invisible in Iowa. So I can see that I've changed the way I see the world. I don't know, Karen, if you wanted to add any other innovations?
One of the things that we've initiated in Arkansas is called the Soybean Science Challenge. And we discovered that even though we are a major agricultural state, it's a big economic driver in our state, that a lot of our youth have not a clue about agriculture. Drive by the fields, but they're just on their way to the next big city to work in the strip mall or the mall. So we determined that we had to reach them in methods that were non-traditional, including a virtual field trip where we broadcasted live like this, but we were broadcasting from a soybean field with an actual farmer that talked to them, and classes interacted just like you're doing today through a Q&A process. And we had scientists, farmers, agriculture agents all there together, and the youth and the students and the teachers could see them in the field responding to and answering their questions live. And it was incredibly successful, and it was successful from our small rural school districts in Southwest Arkansas who in the evaluation said there would never be a time that we would drive 6 hours to take our students to a field trip in soybean field. It wouldn't happen in this kid's lifetime. To Central High School, a very large, very well-funded and high-level science education system, who were very engaged and asked questions of the entomologists that were involved and said that it was a very valuable, unique experience. So we've had to kind of really look, and someone suggested, one of our participants, that we've got to start asking why. Why do youth not know about this? Why are we not reaching them? And what? How do we do it? How do we do it now? And also not lose our traditional clientele, certainly, but it's not either or. And oftentimes we form that question either or. Going to our final question that we want to ask you. What did you gain from this session? We developed this session as a discussion, as well as disseminating content and framing some real contemporary issues that Extension is dealing with in actually all organizations. So we'd like you to respond in the Q&A to 2 specific questions. What did you gain from this session, and what will you do with it? That's really important to us, and we appreciate that kind of feedback.
And while you're thinking about that and writing in, I was looking through the questions, and there are a couple specific questions. One is, where can we get environmental scanning resources and methods? What are the best methods for doing environmental scanning? And let me send you to a recent publication, the latest issue of the Journal of Human Sciences and Extension. We actually have some of the authors online today. There is a great chapter in there on needs assessment, and they give you the difference between environmental scanning, needs assessment, the history of it in extension, etc. And you will find tons of information and resources there. So that's the Journal of Human Sciences and Extension. When it comes to specific methods of doing environmental scanning, I think that depends on what kind of scanning you're doing, and really what question are you trying to ask or answer. So if your question is, what will extension look like a year from now, you may use different methodology than if you're asking, how can we best engage millennials? How can we best attract older people to be part of our programs or our leadership teams? So I think you need to decide what question you're asking and then which methods best fit it. We find that using at least 3 methods is good, so you can triangulate the results. So you may do an online questionnaire of people who've never been a part of extension or specifically focused on a target audience. You may do focus groups. You may do some concept mapping with people. So really, it would be good to think about what the question is, and then you can look for methods from there. And if you're not quite sure of what methods you should use, people who are social scientists have lots of great things that they could share.